Welcome to the Gay Buddhist Forum, where teachers from all schools of Buddhism offer their perspectives on the Dharma and its application in modern times, especially for LGBTQI audiences. These talks are offered freely to the world and made possible by appreciative listeners. If you would like to support our efforts to share the Dharma with underserved audiences, please visit gaybuddhist.org. There you can donate, find a list of upcoming speakers, or enjoy many hundreds of these recorded talks dating back to 1996.
Welcome back. Is anybody joining us here today for the first time or back after a long absence? Nobody in here? How about on Zoom? Could I unmute yourself and say hi? Welcome, Devin.
Thank you so much.
Where are you joining us from?
I'm from Belmont, California, but I'm actually just around the corner.
Oh, okay. Okay. We're going to go around in here at Bartlett Street and say our names. So my name is Cass.
My name is Jeff.
My name's Bob.
I'm Marvin.
I'm Matthew.
I'm Jack. Stephen.
My name is Jerry.
I'm David.
I'm Tony.
I'm Brad.
Okay, welcome everyone. Today we're fortunate to have Anne Gleig back as our speaker. Anne is an associate professor of religion and cultural studies at the University of Central Florida. She's the author of American Dharma, Buddhism Beyond Modernity from Yale University Press, and is currently working on a collaborative book with Amy Langenberg on sexual misconduct and abuse in contemporary Buddhism, which is under advanced contract with Yale University Press. Anne's topic today is losing our religion. So welcome, Anne.
Hi, thank you. So hi everyone. It's nice to see you all again. And for those of you who don't know me, I just wanted to say that, I am a Buddhist practitioner, but I'm going to be speaking today as a scholar of contemporary Buddhism. And so I've got 2 weeks with you. I wanted to just kind of offer you some Buddhist kind of history and some kind of cultural context. And hopefully that will be helpful and interesting to you in, thinking about your own practice. I've put some slides together to just kind of help focus my talk. So let's see. I'm just going to kind of talk through the slides. So essentially, as I said, we've got two classes together. We're doing a bit of Buddhist summer school. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of Buddhist modernism. So don't worry if you don't know what Buddhist modernism is. I'm going to, explain what Buddhist modernism is. I'm going to talk a little bit about how it's different from traditional Buddhism. And then hopefully at the end, we'll have some time to kind of reflect on maybe some of the limitations of Buddhist modernism. And I hope that some of you were able to, do the reading. It's Bob Sharf's Losing Our Religion. You should be able to access that online if you just do a Google search. It's a tricycle article. But if you can't, I've actually got a PDF, so I'll share it with the group after. And then next week, we're going to kind of pick up the thread and we're going to think more about, what's happening right now in North American Buddhism. How does that relate to Buddhist modernism? Like, what's this continuing story, this kind of journey we're on as modern Buddhists? And next week, I've given a reading by me that's accessible via Lions Roar. So you can just Google those readings and they should pop up. So I'll jump right in. So the first part of today's class is, essentially, well, what is Buddhist modernism? So Buddhist modernism is an academic framework. It's an academic term that was basically developed to kind of name, to identify and understand the kind of very kind of distinct, historically distinct forms of Buddhism that have kind of emerged from the encounter between traditional Asian Buddhism and Western modernity. This encounter really kind of started during the historic period of colonialism. I've put Western in parentheses there because it's quite complicated, the origins of modernity. But generally, often when we refer to modernity, we're referring to the kind of modern ideals that kind of grew kind of hand in hand with Western colonialism. So in, thinking about these distinct forms of Buddhism, scholars and also Buddhist leaders themselves kind of came up with different names. Some of those names included Reform Buddhism. One name was Protestant Buddhism, which really pointed to the kind of Protestant influences. Others simply said modern Buddhism. But in kind of academia, we've generally landed on the term Buddhist modernism. And then, there's the ways in which academic kind of frameworks then become used by practitioners. And so there becomes this kind of dialogue between the kind of two groups. So Buddhist modernism, when we think about Buddhist modernism, the most important thing is to realize that, nothing develops out of a vacuum. Things always emerge in distinct historic and cultural contexts. And a major context of Buddhist modernism was colonialism. So colonialism, and again, I apologize if you're familiar with this. There's probably a broad range of experiences in the room. Hopefully I'll, be able to speak to all of you in some way. But essentially colonialism refers to an historic period, that generally is dated from the 16th to the 20th century, in which the kind of emerging European nation states, and then later, the US, which was kind of itself was a development from a colonized nation, but became itself a colonizer, basically started to, explore, essentially conquer the kind of developing world. And so it was basically a project of economic, political, cultural and also religious kind of domination. And essentially the relationship between the colonizers, here, rendered as the minority of foreign invaders, and the indigenous people was, extremely hierarchical. And the colonizers basically, despite being a minority, basically made these decisions that had, often like completely traumatic and devastating impacts on those colonized people. Now, essentially, the colonizers were really convinced of their own superiority. And they really believed, that they had a right to be in other nations and to be kind of, taking charge of other nations. And so why did they think they were so kind of superior? Well, they were convinced that they were superior because of, racism, essentially, but also closely tied in was this belief that, they were bringing kind of civilization. And obviously, I'm heavily, everything's in quotation marks here because this is a really troubled claim. They were bringing science and progress to these, backwards, superstitious countries and nations. And as well as, bringing science, they also were bringing what they believed was the superior religion of Christianity. So they tended to, basically put Christianity on the kind of top of the evolutionary ladder. So essentially, colonization happened across the globe, but in relationship to Buddhism, we're going to focus on Asia. And essentially, when the colonizers, literally went to Asian countries, or when they were in colonizers were in dialogue with Asian leaders from countries that weren't colonized, essentially the colonized people, the Asian people in this case, Asian Buddhists, they had to kind of take the terms of the colonizers on. And they had to basically say why they thought Buddhism was as good as Christianity. So essentially, we talk about this encounter between colonialism and between Western modernity and Asian Buddhism. But it's really, really important to recognize that the encounter didn't happen on an equal playing field, right? It happened in this very kind of hierarchical, oppressive kind of situation. So the Asian Buddhists had to basically respond to what were claimed as the superior values of Christianity, modernity, and science. And so this produced a kind of distinct form of Buddhism across kind of Asia, Southeast Asia, and East Asia. And this is the form of Buddhism we refer to as Buddhist modernism. So this slide is just, basically gives you a sense of some of the types of scholarship that's being, done on Buddhist modernism. If you just look at the book covers, they're always really interesting to analyze. You can see, the words that stick out: revival, reinterpretation, transition, transformation, the modern Buddhist Bible, Buddhist modernism. So this is just this, really interesting body of work that basically helps us understand how, when we, in North America, as, I think I'm noticing most people are, in the room are white, or as converts who aren't white, we are encountering an already modernized Buddhism, right? We're already coming into the tradition, which has already gone through this process of modernization that started, in Asia under the conditions of colonialism. So it's just to give you a sense of, often when, in the contemporary times, sometimes we talk about traditional Buddhism, but we're actually referring to Buddhist modernism in Asia when there's this really long historic trajectory. So I think it just really helps us to get clear of, to see this, to see more clearly the trajectory of the development of Buddhism. So I wanted to just give you a couple of examples of, what does Buddhist modernism look like in Asia? So in terms of the insight tradition, one of the really foundational kind of pioneers of Buddhist modernism was a Burmese monk, Lidai Sayadaw. And essentially, the British, occupied Burma, now Myanmar. And because of, the conditions of colonialism, the king of Burma, who was traditionally seen as the protector of the Dharma, couldn't fulfill this role because, the country had been occupied. And so Sayadaw said, look, we as Buddhist, monastics really need to make sure our tradition isn't lost, kind of taken over by these Christian kind of colonizers. And so one thing that he did was he said, look, we have to kind of take these practices within Buddhism, which have historically been very elite practices, such as, the Buddhist scholarship, high, kind of Buddhist philosophy, and also Buddhist meditation, which, by this time in Buddhism had, just become the practice of, an elite class of monks. And we have to kind of spread it out, right? We have to make it more accessible to, a wider population of monastics and also to lay people, because otherwise, Buddhism, the Dharma will, risk being lost. So essentially he kind of popularized and kind of started to widely distribute the study and practice of Buddhist meditation and philosophy. Great book called The Birth of Insight. And then one of his students, Mahasi Sayadaw, basically then opened this huge meditation center, and he and his monastics began to teach Vipassana in the kind of intensive retreat kind of formats. Now, this was an historic development. It hadn't happened prior to colonialism. Prior to colonialism, as I said, meditation practice had it become quite a rarefied practice. And only, a small class of monastics would practice meditation, certainly not lay people. And, the kind of, pursuit of, nibbana was kind of seen as, that's like, it's something that you can only get to over lifetimes and lifetimes. And this lineage basically said, no, look, this is a practice that, large groups of people can do, including lay people, and it is actually possible to become enlightened. So there was this kind of, revival of Buddhist practices. But again, this hadn't happened in traditional Buddhism. So this is a really important lineage because it's one of the two major influences on the US insight lineage, the Vipassana tradition. The other influence is the Thai forest tradition. I haven't got time to go into the Thai forest tradition, but they basically went through quite a similar process in which Thailand was never literally colonized, but the Thai king and Thai Buddhist leaders really kind of embraced modern kind of discourses, and they started themselves a kind of modernization process, which included a kind of emphasis on meditation practice also for monks and laity. So you've got these kind of processes happening, right, where there's essentially a kind of democratization in a way of Buddhist practices, which is great on the one hand and is a response to combating colonialism. But essentially, thinking of a limitation is that when you start to focus more on one practice, then other practices, can kind of drop away in importance. And so essentially we start to see the beginnings of what will eventually, if you trace the line, this is like really the beginning of eventually what's going to become like secular mindfulness practice, right? So if you follow this thread to secular mindfulness practice, I teach secular mindfulness practice to my college students, and they don't even know that it's a Buddhist practice. Like the practice of decontextualization becomes so long that, so much is lost. So again, we're just thinking about these movements and then how they kind of develop, how they start to develop once they become, come over to a kind of Anglo-European context. So these are some of the characteristics of Buddhist modernism in Southeast Asia. I hope that if you can see this slide, you can see that the words that I've put in, quotation marks is because these are claims. They're not historically, factual. And they're quite contentious claims. Because if you say, real Buddhism is just in the texts, that's really discounting so much more of Buddhism, which is so much more than just texts. If you say that Buddhism is rational, it's not to say that there aren't rational kind of strands within Buddhist practice, but that then means that other parts of Buddhism, which are not rational, then become kind of discounted. So essentially, whenever you have a selective presentation of Buddhism, there's always reasons for that selection. In this case, this selective kind of presentation of Buddhism was, because Buddhists wanted to basically speak back to Western colonizers. Buddhists wanted to say, hey, you're saying that, that science is the highest goal. Well, look, our religion is super scientific. And in fact, our religion is more scientific than Christianity. So it's this kind of presentation is happening in a kind of, in a dialogue, or I hesitate to use the word dialogue because of colonialism, but in an encounter with colonialism. And that's not to say good things, valuable things don't develop out of Buddhist modernism. But it is to show that, like, all forms of Buddhism are, selective and kind of culturally shaped. And, it's always important to think about, what's gained, what's the strengths in modern Buddhism, and then what might be lost in modern Buddhism, like what doesn't it do so well at. So I also wanted to give you an example of the process of Buddhist modernism in Japan, just as an example. So in Japan, Japan wasn't directly colonized, but there was a modernist reformation in the Meiji period. And essentially a new school of Buddhists, basically, Japanese Buddhists, basically said, look, we feel Buddhism has become kind of corrupt due to like cultural kind of overlays and, creations that don't have anything to do with a real Buddhism. And we want to get back to the real Buddhism. And like their Southeast Asia counterparts, they were like, look, real Buddhism, the core of Buddhism is rational, it's empirical, it's aligned with modern science. They were very interested, similarly, in individual meditation practice. There was this real emphasis on like meditation as the heart of Zen. And they often talked of Zen almost as if it was above history or above culture. So, hopefully, if you're looking at this slide, you can see it's very parallel to the process that happened in Southeast Asia. And this modernist lineage is really what comes to the United States, through different channels, but one channel is Hakuun Yasutani. Hakuun Yasutani was a teacher of Philip Kapleau Roshi. And Philip Kapleau Roshi, you're probably familiar with him. His book, The Three Pillars of Zen, is one of those, books that, often when I do interviews with, American Zen converts, I say, how did you discover Zen? And they were like, I read The Three Pillars of Zen when I was in high school or, when I was in college. So essentially, you can hopefully see, the American kind of convert lineages really come out of these Asian modernist lineages. Again, that's not, an all bad thing. It's limited because often they don't realize the history. So, for Kapleau, he didn't necessarily realize, okay, this Japanese Buddhist teacher that I'm, working with is a Buddhist modernist. He didn't have the historical sense of the form of Buddhism he was encountering. So, he just took that as traditional Zen. And the same, that typically was the same that you'll see in, white convert lineages. They often talk about their traditional Buddhist teachers. And that's the kind of value of historical study. We can kind of step back and say, oh, wait a minute, these Asian Buddhist teachers were, they were already modernizing Buddhism in this wider conversation. So again, it just gives us a richer sense of the types of Buddhism Western convert lineages have kind of taken up. Okay, so I'm going to I'm sorry for going quick. I'm getting a lot of information in, and hopefully we'll have some time for questions to unpack it. So I wanted to just give you a sense of what happens in Asia in terms of the historical kind of cultural, political transformations of Buddhism. And now I want to move into, well, what happens when that Buddhist modernism kind of comes to the US? Like, how is it continued? How is this kind of journey of modernism continued? So the most important thing to recognize is that Buddhism first came to the United States, not through white converts, right? It actually came through Asian immigrants, Chinese and Japanese immigrants who had come over to the US for work, to work on the railroads or to work in the sugar cane plantations. And many of these were Shin Buddhists as well as Zen Buddhists, but the Shin Buddhist Jodo Shinshu community was one of the first to come. And Asian American Buddhists, they were the first Buddhists in the US to build Buddhist temples. They were the first Buddhists to develop Buddhist organizations. The Jodo Shinshu community changed its name to the Buddhist Churches of America. You can see that like westernization process, right? In Japan, it wasn't called church, right? Because obviously church is a Christian word. One of the reasons actually it changed its name to church was because they were facing intense hostility and discrimination and racial violence. And so they wanted to, they kind of assimilated. So they took on some kind of Protestant characteristics. And I really want to stress that the Buddhist Churches of America, the Jodo Shinshu lineage, was also a Buddhist modernist lineage. It wasn't like, it was only the white Buddhists doing the modernization, right? And the story of the modernization of the Buddhist Churches of America has been really, it's been neglected by scholars. Fortunately, that's changing. So a dear friend and colleague, Scott Mitchell, he's a dean of the Institute of Buddhist Studies, which is in Berkeley. He's actually writing a book on the role that these, Jodo Shinshu community played in American Buddhist modernism. I'm really looking forward to this book. I think it's going to be a real game changer. And as you can see here, he says that despite practicing American Buddhism for 50 years before the kind of Dharma bums, it's Anditi Suzuki who are often credited with, modernizing Buddhism in the US. Jodo Shinshu's being ignored. Why? Essentially because of racism. So I'm going to pick up the story of the Dharma bums, but I really wanted to stress, that they come later, that the modernization process in the US is underway further through the Jodo Shinshu lineage. I really recommend you inviting Scott to talk when this book comes out. Okay, but I'm going to pick up the white convert lineage, right? So essentially through the kind of Zen teachers who kind of came over to the US, D.T. Suzuki, was another very influential figure. Then you get, this kind of the beat kind of interest in Buddhism. And I always tell my students, my undergrad students, I always say, I feel really embarrassed because, the Dharma bums was like one of my first introductions to Buddhism as a teenager. In Liverpool, somehow I'd got my hands on a copy of the Dharma bums. So, I think for many, white Buddhists, they come to Buddhism through this kind of lineage, the kind of beats, and then, the hippies. Now, what's quite interesting about this, paragraph, you may be familiar with it. It tends to be quoted a lot. Is, if you put this paragraph in, next to a traditional Zen text, it's like, what? It's like, this is so different. It's a very kind of modern, but also not just modern Zen Buddhism, American white modern Zen Buddhism, right? And so you can see, I love looking at the picture because, representing, Buddhism is, an individual guy, in Zazen, right? There's many images that you could use to represent Zen, but, you've got this kind of romantic, kind of image. So hopefully this image, you can kind of connect, and the quote, you can kind of think back to that slide on the modernization of Zen, which stressed like individual meditation practice and, this kind of transcendent experience, that anyone could kind of access. It does throw in a bit more kind of, wildness, I guess, than the Zen lineages, which, reflect the beat part of the beat Zen. And then, moving forward, to the 1960s, the Dharma bums, late 50s, moving forward to the 60s and then the 70s, you've got the beginning of, two major white convert lineages. So you can see this is the San Francisco Zen Center, with Suzuki Roshi in the middle. And you get a sense of the demographic here. Obviously, I think the first thing that will strike us all is how white everyone is. And then if you can see the Insight meditation community with Sharon Salzberg, Joe Goldstein, Jack Cornfield, and Jackie Mandel Schwartz, behind them is Mahasi Sayadaw, right? So this is the Asian, Buddhist modernist figure that I introduced us to earlier, who had started this mass retreat kind of practice in Myanmar. Essentially what happened was, these young Americans went over to Asia. It was during the 1960s when there was a tremendous kind of romantic interest in Asia. And they trained with, the Burmese lineages. They went to the centers, they did the 10-day retreats, they did the 3-month retreats. And then they came back to the US and started their own center. Now, remember what I said, like what happens is in Myanmar, there is the colonizers come, the Brits come, and the Asian monastics say, how can we protect the Dharma? Okay, we're going to make it more democratic. We're going to popularize it. And then the next generation of Myanmar monastics say, yeah, we're going to make it even more popular. We're going to actually start these centers now. So they kind of, take it one stage further. And then the white Americans go and practice with them and say, yeah, we're going to take this and make it even more accessible, right? So here's a sense of how they make it even more accessible, right? So this is a quote from Jack Cornfield, right? So he's like, look, we want to take this practice of insight meditation, which we've learned from our Asian monastic teachers, and we want to make it even more simple. So we want to get rid of all rituals, right? We want to get rid of robes. So, for example, you can see none of these Americans are monastics, right? So whereas the insight meditation centers in Myanmar, they're led and taught by monastics. Now but lay people can go, but now you've got the lay people becoming teachers and starting their centers, right? So we're going to get rid of chanting, which is, a core part of Buddhist practice. Certainly what would be part of the meditation centers in Asia. And in fact, let's just get rid of the whole religious tradition, right? Let's popularize it to such a degree that, we're just going to really focus on the insight tradition. And, we'll have some suttas. We'll give a Dharma talk and we'll reference a few suttas. But there's this, continual process of modernization that's happening. And then after the insight teachers, right, come the secular mindfulness. So that's why I kind of, wanted to bring in secular mindfulness earlier. So just remembering you're going through this long process of historic and cultural kind of decontextualization. So what are some common characteristics of convert Buddhism? Now, basically, as I've already really emphasized, really at the heart of convert Buddhism, white Buddhism, is the focus on meditation practice. Like you all started your session today with a meditation sit, right? That's lovely. I really enjoy meditation myself. It's how I got into Buddhism. But why did you start with meditation practice, right? Why didn't you start with chanting? Or why didn't you start with merit making? Why didn't you start with a ritual? There's a reason for why you started with meditation, right? So I hope that I've given you some of that reason in the earlier slides. Generally, there tends to be, a downplaying of cosmology. So often in like convert, lineages, they don't talk so much about like the 6 realms of samsara, or the kind of supernatural beings of Buddhism. Ritual kind of falls out. Obviously not as much in Zen and certainly not as much in Tibetan Buddhism, but the insight tradition is a really good example of how ritual falls out. Also, communal elements tend to fall out. Think back to Jack Kerouac. He's sitting alone on that hill with the moon and a bottle in front of him. Where's his Sangha? Where's the Buddhist community? It tends to be psychologically oriented. We especially in the 60s, it was a very therapeutic culture. So that kind of translation in psychology happens. This one's really kind of interesting. So essentially, there tends to be a split between essential Dharma, like what is the core teaching, and kind of cultural Buddhism, which is like what's the add-on that we can get rid of. Now, we see this split in Southeast Asia, right? We see the same thing happening in Southeast Asia, and we see the same thing happening in Japan. There was, the modernists in Japan were like, Buddhism's become so institutional and cultural, right? So it's already a part of Asian Buddhist modernism, but it becomes super problematic in the US. Why? Right, I'll tell you why. Because it becomes racialized in the US. So essentially what happens in the US is, guess who's doing essential Dharma? It's us. It's the white Buddhists are doing the essential Dharma, and Asian American Buddhists are suddenly doing the cultural Dharma. So if you're like, hey, white people are doing the real Buddhism and these Asian American heritage communities are just doing cultural Buddhism, you're really creating a hierarchy. It's essentially a racialized hierarchy, right? You're like, hey, I'm doing your tradition, but I'm doing your tradition even more than you. It tends to be individualistic. In terms of demographics, it's overwhelmingly white, which I talked about a little in my last presentation. Class tends to be middle class towards the upper middle. It does tend to be liberal because, a lot of converts came from the kind of boomer hippie generation. There is an increase. There's a good gender increase in gender equity, but there does tend to be little racial or class diversity. So this is obviously some generalizations. I'm sure you can be like, hey, I can find an exception, but we're, looking at a wide phenomena here, right? So that leads me to the last slide, which is, okay, having talked about what is Buddhist modernism in an Asian context, then what does Buddhist modernism look like in a US context? We're now going to talk about, well, what's the problems? What's the limits of Buddhist modernism? Hopefully I've already pointed some out, but I want to just, kind of emphasize them. One of the critiques is that it's too focused on meditation. Meditation is super. I think everyone here will agree that we've all benefited from meditation practice. I really could do with more meditation practice in my current life. But meditation is only one part of the Buddhist path. Even if you think of, the Eightfold Path, it's one part of that path. And if you just focus on one part of a total, integrated path, you're gonna, see that there's gonna be a kind of imbalance that's gonna happen. And you're gonna lose a lot. You're gonna lose so much depth and so much richness of, this like, really, profound tradition. Buddhist modernism, especially in the US, because I would say there is such an individualistic ethos and cultural bed, a kind of cultural soil of the US is individualistic. It really kind of amplifies the individual meditation practice. It's really like it's kind of like a collision between the focus on individual meditation practice and the kind of general individualism of the US. Buddhist modernism has been really critiqued because it, as I said, because they were talking to the Buddhists were talking to the colonizers. And so they really wanted to say, hey, we can play your game and we can beat you at your game. They really tend to overemphasize the empirical aspects of Buddhism. And again, that just cuts out so much of the richness of Buddhism. And it kind of takes this hugely beautiful, vast tradition and kind of squeezes it into one lane, And so again, not saying that there isn't value in thinking about like, okay, what kind of conversations can one have, across science and Buddhism? but it's just a very narrow. It's just if it's taken as the only lane, it's narrow. And then the last point is really what I wanted to point out about the way in which this Buddhist modernist rhetoric of there's a core Dharma, a real Dharma, an objective Dharma, and then there's all this cultural crap, that we need to just get rid of. That becomes so racialized in the US. It really does kind of reproduce white supremacy. And the book to go deeper with this is The Race and Religion in American Buddhism. Scientific Buddha really, picks up on the critique of the science critique. Bob Sharf's article talks about all of these problems. And my book, American Dharma, goes into like much more depth with what I've taught today. I'm really sorry I gave like a speed lecture in Buddhism, but I wanted to make sure we had time at the end for questions. So I'm going to come out of the screen share and then let's get some questions in and try and unpack my extremely compressed lecture. If you're still here, hopefully you're still here. Hey, listen, there's no exam, so that's
Jeff, yeah.
Alrighty, get some questions.
A very informative talk. This is Jeff, and I really appreciated the depth of what you talked about. I'm wondering about how Buddhism began in India and then migrated to Tibet and became distinctly Tibetan, and then to China, and eventually I believe the sequence was to Japan.
Right, okay. So essentially, the historic transmission of Buddhism, I really, you really need another class on that. But essentially in its whole history, of course, Buddhism starts in India. The first Buddhist, it's a missionary religion. Buddhism, in fact, some scholars have argued Buddhism is the first missionary religion. So, the first Buddhist monks, missionaries go down, they go down from Asia into Sri Lanka, and then they start to spread across Southeast Asia. And then, there's a Mahayana kind of movement that is, happens, several hundred years after the death of the historic Buddha. And then, that's a whole new kind of set of religious literature. That starts to go, then there's a northern route up through India and across the Silk Road. And then it starts to spread across up into Tibet and across East Asia. There's these great movements of, and then there's Vajrayana Buddhism, which really takes root actually in Tibet. So, historically, all of those, someone's asked a question about Chinese Buddhism and the transmission of, the Theravada, Mahayana and Vajrayana kind of Buddhist forms, is happening as it's like major movements across, major transformations across Asia. Often the Buddhist forms are picked up by the elite class. Happened in Tibet, the king of Tibet, happens in China with the emperors. So Buddhism becomes like, it's a missionary, in a way, it kind of becomes a religion of empire because it's picked up by these, King Asoka in India. It becomes, this great kind of religion of empire across Asia. My research really focuses on the modern period, which, generally scholars, there's a lot of debate in scholarship, as you're probably aware of, but, just very rudimentary categories. We might think about some scholars also like to talk about early Buddhism as actually in India, very early Buddhism as distinct from traditional Buddhism. So they'll say there's early Buddhism, then there's traditional Buddhism, and then there's modern Buddhism. And then I say, oh yeah, now we're in postmodern Buddhism. That's kind of like my thesis. But yeah, Buddhism has always historically, and culturally kind of transformed and moved across contexts. So that's really important to recognize that where, Buddhist modernism is, part of this greater story of, the transformation of Buddhism. But it's our story, right? It's our story. It's our particular story. The modern story is our particular story. So I think it's both helpful to situate it in this larger process. It's not like there was a monolithic Buddhist, traditional Buddhism that was, untouched, and then all of a sudden it became modernized. There's waves of cultural translation and process and adaptation that are happening across cultural epochs and geographical contexts. However, some people do argue that because of the modern world because modernity was such a abrupt kind of departure from earlier religious views, from traditional views of the world, which were, tended to be more in a religious framework. They essentially argue that the split between the traditional and the modern is a distinct split. So, so they say, well, Buddhism's always transformed. Yeah, look at any Chinese Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism. But something really dramatic happens in the modern era. So they really want to kind of emphasize it as a particularly disruptive transformation. But that it's a debate within academia because we love fighting with each other. And then with Chinese Buddhism, actually I'm really glad you brought up Chinese Buddhism because I didn't have a chance to talk about it. So another I looked at the critiques of Buddhist modernism, and I've got another slide. I'll show you it next week. I didn't get to it today because I was worried. There's actually a critique of understanding Buddhist modernism as a Western phenomena. And that critique basically says, that's why I also put Western in quotation marks. That critique says, look, transformations in Buddhism actually start in China. The Chinese were actually doing modernization before these stories of the Southeast Asian transformations and the Japanese modernism. The scholars kind of take the story back a little bit. So Chinese Buddhism is an incredible site of modernization. And there's just some really exciting scholarship on Chinese Buddhist modernism, which I'd be happy to share with you if you reach out to me. I've got a couple pictures on the slide I didn't get to today. But certainly, and Tibet as well. I didn't really linger on Tibetan Buddhism. Tibet's got its own story of modernization, which was a bit distinct because of its geographical kind of separation. So each form of Asian Buddhism has its own story of modernization that is, super important to pay attention to. Unfortunately, with the time we had, I had to be, really generic and broad today.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. I always love these questions. And I wouldn't, the talk with the Tibetan Buddhism, there's actually quite a lot of interest in new scholarship being done that actually pushes against this idea that it was sealed off from modernization. So I think that I'd say yes and no to that question. There are definitely modernist threads, but you don't see the kind of broad movements that you see at the same time in other Asian nations. I've never come across a Buddhist I just want to say this question's great. So Zerdan, thank you. I've never come across a Buddhist tradition that doesn't claim to be the pure Dharma. So I think this is a really important point because I think part of the religious imagination, not just Buddhism, but I'm a bit familiar with, different religions, having, been a scholar for now 30 years. And I noticed the same, as part of kind of religious sectarianism, religious groups like to say, they like to say to the groups that came before them, oh, you've gone a bit astray and we've got the religious truth. And often that's reflected in their names. You'll see that sometimes their names translate to, the pure form or So absolutely. Religious traditions, because of sectarianism and just because of the religious imagination, do tend to claim for themselves a specialness. And that's often centered around rhetoric of purity or the core teaching. So I think that's absolutely true. For me, as a scholar of modern Buddhism, I'm interested in tracing how that intersects with other cultural discourses. So in the case of modernism, the core becomes the objective. We've got objective Buddhism, not subjective. That's obviously because science is objective. So then you see the way that religious sectarian imagination aligns with the scientific sense of having that, ultimate knowledge. I'm also interested in how the pure Buddhism becomes racialized. And then it's like the white Buddhists are claiming. But I agree with you. Yes, it's not just exclusive to white convert lineages or to Buddhist modernism. It's just the distinct ways it shows up in those lineages, if that's helpful in any way. Excuse me. So a Sangha is, what a great word, what a great question. I apologize for not clarifying it. So traditionally Buddhists talk about the fourfold Sangha, male monastics, female monastics, and the laity. And in traditional Buddhism, the Sangha is really about the monastic Sangha, right? That's the ultimate Sangha, the real Sangha in a way. The role of the laity is to support the monastic Sangha, through donation, through feeding them, through providing material support. What happens in Buddhist modernism, so interesting, is remember that slide where, because of the threat of colonialism, Lidai Sayadaw was like, hey, we can't count on the king to protect the Dharma, so we've got to kind of spread it a bit. It starts this democratization. And so now, as that democratization continued, often like in Western convert Sanghas, when they say Sangha, they essentially just mean generally the Buddhist community. But historically it has referred more to the monastic Sangha. So again, that's just itself such an interesting phenomena of transformations. What's good about that? As a woman, I would say for me, the emphasis on the Sangha, the growth of the lay, the raising status of the lay teacher for me has been, helpful for women. It's kind of pierced Buddhist patriarchy. So I'd say that was one good thing. On the other hand, there's a lot of lay teachers who teach where you're like, well, what are your actual qualifications to teach? What's your training? And that's not to say every monastic's a great teacher. A lot of my teachers are lay teachers. It's just, I just want to invite us to move out of polemics, move out of this is good, this is bad, and really think what's valuable in the modernization, what's not so valuable. All right, maybe one more question. I've got another meeting at 3. That one about
and people can't read your questions that are in the room. And people have their hands up.
I'm so sorry.
It's very hard to know these people are tossing questions out on this thing when we've got.
I apologize. I was totally.
It's not your fault. It's not your fault.
Okay, Tom, I can see you.
Hey, Anne. Thank you. Thanks for a wonderful talk. I always appreciate your talks because they help orient us to the world of Buddhism. Wherever you land in a religion or a practice, you think, oh, this is it. This is the essential thing. And so you're like the push pin at the mall map saying, you are here. And so I really like that. One question I had was, does your work look at Nichiren Buddhism? Because there again, that's like the beginning of, there's a modernistic thing that happens in 1200, they break away. And then even more modern, there's this schism where the Westerners are kicked out and because they want to bring the practice to lay people, not just for the monks. Do you, I wonder if you include that.
Yeah, no, I don't look at that work, and I'm so glad that you brought it into the space. My research population is the white convert lineage. And so, there's so much that my work misses. But it's so helpful to, bring out these other, modernist lineages, and kind of get a sense of, the kind of multiple, that's actually a model that some scholars use. And I actually do talk about the different models in my book, not to be selling my book or anything, but, because of what you just brought up, like scholars are like in a community, we're having like a conversation with each other, right? So scholars are like, well, look, this is a great example of another modernist lineage that's not just, the Southeast Asian ones. So they talk about multiple modernities. And so we, as the conversation grows, you get to see all these different visions of how modernism plays out in specific contexts. And as you said, in some contexts, it's like, we're modern in this sense. We're modern in the sense that we might do this one reform, but we don't want to go down the gender equity road, right? Or it's like we're modern because we've got female teachers and we've got lay teachers, but wait a minute, everyone's middle class and white, so that's like what we missed, So no, my work doesn't address that, but I could probably find some scholarship for you. There's, as I say, there's such a rich body now on Buddhist modernism. So do feel free to shoot me an email and I'll follow that up with you.
Thank you. Could you put your email in the quickly?
Of course. Definitely. There's so much great work on Buddhist modernism, and I just wish we had all day to talk about it.
I know this is such a rich topic that you've opened up here.
I'm like such a chatterbox. I'm really sorry. Normally I'd be happy to stay, but I've got this other Zoom thing at 3. But I'll be back next week. I hope you will join me. I look forward to it.
Okay, us too. Thank you so much, Anne.
Yeah, they're all. It's lovely to be together.
Okay, we'll do announcements now. We have hot water for tea, and there's some cookies out on the credenza. So please stay and enjoy the fellowship of the Sangha. I'll be coming around with the Dana bowl. Your contribution of $10 to $20 helps us meet our expenses to rent this lovely place, to pay for the newsletter that comes out quarterly and is sent. Most copies are sent to people who are incarcerated. Helps pay for our online presence. And I guess there's a sign-up sheet on the credenza outside too if you'd like to be part of the Sangha's directory. Any other announcements? Going once. Okay, so let's gather for the dedication of merit. And again, Anne will be back next week, and her topic next week will be the shifting landscape of Buddhism in America. And there's a reading that she recommends. There's a link to it on our website. By the power and truth of this practice, may all beings have happiness and the causes of happiness. May all be free from sorrow and the causes of sorrow. May all never be separated from the sacred happiness which is without sorrow. May all live in equanimity, without too much attachment or too much aversion, believing in the equality of all that lives. Let's hope there's not too much irritability.
Thank you for listening to the Gay Buddhist Forum. If you would like to hear several new talks per month and be notified of upcoming speakers so you can participate live, please subscribe to this podcast, like us on Facebook, and join our mailing list by visiting gaybuddhist.org.